For the first time in their history, they had the country for themselves. In the end, we had Fidel Castro. Somehow the situation changed. There were no more Americans anymore, but this country has shown that it's absolutely possible. Hi, here is Marco Villenius, your traveling futurist, this time in Havana, Cuba. I'm gonna tell you about why I think one countries are rich, the other poor, and what is that hinges there the countries to make the next step in their development. I'm standing here on this stadium, which is very close to the very heart of the city of Havana here in Cuba. And as you can see, this stadium is most in the rubbles. Here on the other side, we have a very famous Malecon street, which goes along the shoreline of Havana. When we are thinking about the Cuba, we're thinking about something very unique, but at the same time, it's something that the story has been told before. Now, this is the story of the country. Like many other countries in the South, a lot of this past was actually sort of controlled and mastered by other countries. In this case, particularly when you look at the first part of the last century, Americans were very heavily involved here. In fact, in a way, you can say that when it comes to the 1950s, it was more or less owned by the Americans. And Americans were the ones that were running here businesses. For a good while, there was a democratic state that was run in this country. I mean, in those days, of course, it doesn't mean exactly the same kind of a democracy we have today. But anyway, a sort of democracy. And then became Batista. Batista was the guy who overtook the government, who came from the military and sort of seized the country for his own purposes. And that built the ground for the revolution that was then later led by Fidel Castro, his comrades, and his brother Raul. Off went this torrent. Off went Americans. Instead, for the first time in their history, they had the country for themselves. The original idea was that after the coup, after taking the Batista over the rail, they can finally build a new democratic country that is run by the people of the country. But actually something a little bit different occurred, because soon after it became quite evident that this country is actually run by only one man, and that man was obviously Fidel Castro. Also, what happened was that, let's say, the more moderate people who were a part of the revolution and fighting that revolution happened to get sidetracked. In the end, we had Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro ran this country for a very, very long time, for decades and the decade. What happened to the country was that there was this strong anti-feeling about the Americans. So what did Fidel do? Turn to Soviet Union to seek the support from there. And indeed, he found support. So what started to emerge was this heavy union between the Soviet Union and Cuba. Cuba was essentially run by the communist regime, where the party and the leader of the party was basically the one that was leading the country, in the very much in the same fashion as it was in those days Soviet Union. Well, what happened too was that there was no more entrepreneurship, no more private companies. Instead, only state-run companies had a right to exist. In fact, one friend of mine here was the man who was actually leading the very last private company here, and that lasted until 2004. But most of the private companies were short-lived right after the revolution. What was the result of these events was that the country became rather stagnated by its economy. Even if they were able to build a very nice social support system with free education and free medicine, those types of amenities that very few developing countries, if any, could show at the time or even today. This was something that was particularly striking in this type of a country. What happened was that there came a very strong social cohesion because the policy was that nobody is left out from the system. Everybody gets provided the very basic needs. That was the very policy of Fidel Castro, and we should of course congratulate him for that. But on the other hand, he left no space for private entrepreneurship, and that meant that this country started to lean more backwards, became a country where particularly young people, and maybe quite a few older as well, didn't anymore see that they had their future here. So they were forced to leave the country. Lots of them left for United States, for Florida. There is a very flourishing big community of Cubans in Florida, but not only that, they spread around the world. A lot of people started to flee from the country, and of course that further pushed the whole country into the very stagnation. And that again led to the situation where future prospects were very few to find for the people, particularly for the young people. This whole situation then later became like a real big problem, because once the country gets stagnated and it loses the dynamics, what happened is that everybody not only start to look elsewhere, but also that nobody is taking care anymore. And that's why in this stadium you can see that all these rubbles, you walk through this city or any other city in Cuba and you see the same thing. Somehow the situation changed. There were no more Americans anymore, no more tyrants that were supported by the foreign forces. But instead, the tyranny came from inside. Why I'm saying this? I'm saying this because we as human beings, we need freedom. We need freedom to express ourselves. We need freedom to have opinions, different opinions, not just those opinions that had those who are in power. If you don't allow that to happen, it reduces you as a human being and it reduces you as a country. Freedom of expression is the key asset to build a rich culture. But it's also very important when you're building the economy. The economy should be built on the partnership, should be built on the solidarity and collaboration. But we need the ecosystem. If you have a monopolies in the economy and you don't have any options there, it always means the same thing. The efficiency goes down and the ruling of the systems goes up. It is not enough to have a country, an independent country, that is not governed by foreign capitalists. It's also not good enough to have advanced social system where you provide the basic need for all people, even if it's very, very important. But if you leave out the freedom to express yourself, the freedom to try to build your own dreams, companies, initiatives of all kinds. If you cut that off, the country stops developing. That's what has happened everywhere in the world where we have seen this type of the very, very authoritarian state to emerge. So there is no exception. It's like a natural law. This happens time and again. So the key lesson here, you need to be understanding when you build this kind of a country, that who are we as a human being, how we are supported best. Of course, we need to have a certain agreed principles and norms and rule of law and all that. But also, we need to give space for creation, because creativity, at the end of the day, is something that inspires people, we as human beings, more than anything else. And out of that also comes something which is the other side of the freedom, which is the responsibility. Because if you have a freedom, you also have a responsibility. And when you have a responsibility, you are caring. You don't find these type of places where things have gone to the rubbles and there's dirt everywhere. No, you don't find in the places where people have ownership, a true ownership and freedom. So this is the great lesson. Of course, when we look at the state of the Cuba right now, we should say to Americans, hey, you put that embargo over 60 years ago. You put that all that limitations, that no trade, no transactions between the Cuba and United States. That happened so long time ago. It's time to move on. Of course, here in Cuba, maybe Cuba needs to reinvent itself as well, because there is a 60 years plus for learning what works and what doesn't work. So the system should learn how to make things in a different way. And indeed, if you look at the policies of the recent years, there's a lot of new freedom about the building the company here in Cuba. So something has changed, but I don't think that nothing fundamentally changed unless you give that freedom to express themselves here in this country, and that they haven't still done. There is only one part. I hope personally that this power system here will finally find out that the only way to move forward and to have a future again is to enable people to express themselves, to try to be entrepreneurial, but also that let them also start to care, so that we don't have these rubbles, we don't have this dirt around here. And I think that will happen. I come from Finland. When I saw what has happened with Estonia in the 40 or 50 years of Soviet rule, everything was more or less in a rubble in Estonia as well, as a result of the communist regime. But it took only mostly 5-10 years for Estonia to rebuild itself and get back on the track where the Estonia is now. It's beautiful. You go to the Tallinn, and Tallinn is a beautiful capital of Estonia. No dirt as it was then, no not caring. That's the city that is being cared again, as it is for the country as well. And this is because we fundamentally, human beings, if we have the freedom to do what we really want to do, which is not just to, working on our self-interest, but participate, contribute the way we see fit, then that builds a totally new energy and dynamics into the country. And we have seen already a lot of positive cases this happening. Not very far from here is a country of Costa Rica. Costa Rica is a fine example of a Latin American country which completely reformulated its development. With a result, it is a very affluent country where people have all those possibilities that everybody should have. Watch my Costa Rican videos for that in my YouTube channel, and you will see that the Costa Rican example is a striking one when we think about how differently these countries in the south can be led with a very, very promising results. I believe 100% that this is also a very possibility here in Cuba. And most likely at some point in time, we're gonna see that. I'm here now also with one of the project team that we have from Finland Futures Research Center to build a new energy system into this country, to think how to modernize the energy and electricity production and consumption in this country. Because this country, when you go around here in Cuba, you will see it's very green, there is a lot of sun, there is a lot of wind, there is even an ocean with a lot of energy there. The potential is huge in this country to provide all of its energy and electricity by itself. Well, currently 95% of the energy comes from outside as an import, which is crazy. But one example, what type of the opportunities we have in this country. Also, most of the food in this very fertile country is imported. It's imported from another countries, which is again very foolish for this type of a country who has so much opportunities to grow its own food. There are lots of things that should be done with this country, but also we need to remember that this is also a country which has beautiful music, beautiful sense of art and culture, where people are still smiling a lot, and it has a good vibes. So a lot of opportunity. We just need to see how we can actually support them to build this kind of a new Cuba, which I strongly believe will wait for us around the corner. But of course, that doesn't happen by itself. And probably in some ways or another, we can be a positive change behind it. We can help them to reinvent themselves. And perhaps with that, there would come also a new model of a development, which is more fair, more just, more human. And with the all good assets they also have from their past, they could probably build something where other countries could follow that type of example. For instance, I told you earlier that this is one of the few truly developing nations that for decades have already have a free education and free medicine. And that is of course something that we should have everywhere in the world in the future. That is exactly that type of the commodity that should be provided for all people that are living in a particular country. The question is how we organize that. But this country has shown that is absolutely possible. Subscribe to my channel and see other related videos. See you soon.